This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Attorney Dave Richards has been involved with some of the most significant civil liberties, voting rights, labor, and school finance cases in Texas and American history. A key figure in the political and cultural currents coursing through Austin in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are such a pivotal part of this podcast. And if you want to learn more about his story, he has a riveting memoir, Once Upon a Time in Texas, A Liberal in the Lone Star State, from the University of Texas Press. Thank you so much for joining us, Dave.
Well, glad to be here. David was introduced to me by Stan Alexander, that I've always referred to as kind of my adopted father image, since I lost mine when I was 9 months old, and Stan, as my UT English instructor when I was 17 years old, straight out of McCallum High School over to the campus to get everybody's acknowledged worst course that you can possibly conceive. When you go to the university, you're probably going to fail freshman English, so just get used to it. Don't worry about it.
So, Dave, how did Stan Alexander come into your orbit or acquaintance?
There was a fellow I was practicing law with who had played the banjo and hung out at Threadgill's, and by the name of Fred Weldon. And I think Fred invited Stan down from Denton a time or two, and then one of those times he brought Eddie with him. Sort of my memory in those terrible Dallas days of right-wing lunacy that dominated the city during that era. So anytime you found a kindred spirit, you tended to grasp onto them because the outside world was so horrible. That's the way I remember Dallas, frankly.
And that would have been about the same time that you all crossed paths, you think, through Stan?
It would have been a little earlier, perhaps, but about the same time. Yeah. Ann and I were in Dallas from 57 to 69, with one time out year in Washington, but that was it. But Stan was a wonderful person who I got to know later when I did East Texas litigation over in Nacogdoches. I'd see Stan routinely over there when he went back to Nacogdoches.
Did the two of you, Eddie and Dave, stay in touch from then on, or was it the kind of thing that you met then and then later on put it together that you knew each other back then?
It was later on, I think, after Ann and I moved to Austin. Well, Eddie just said, as we were talking earlier, that he actually had driven Ann out to see the house that we ended up buying in Westlake. Yeah. What I remember is Eddie coming by one time and wanted Ann and I to go with him to see this old armory he'd found. He was thinking of making into a music venue. And we went down to this dusty old place. And I suppose we were encouraging. I don't know if Eddie thought we were going to provide financing. If he was thinking of financing, that didn't happen, but we tried to be encouraging. That's my memory.
Did you think it was going to happen, or were you just trying to encourage a friend?
It did seem to be improbable.
So I was thinking about the timing of some of this, and the Vulcan's winding down in the first half of 1970. The Armadillo comes online in late summer, August of 70. This is also a moment in the city where a lot of the currents of the 1960s are really at their crest, right? Where these things are picking up and thinking about, politics and the anti-war movement in particular. So that in the middle of all this, it's in May that the largest anti-war demonstrations that Austin experiences go on. And it's one of those, Dave, you as a lawyer got sort of roped into this situation a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the May 1970 post-Kent state?
Well, as a forerunner to it, of course, the Austin authorities, police and state troopers were just aggregated on the off campus to kind of keep students from getting off campus and into town. It was just an insane confrontation at the time. I remember there's a wonderful photo of that era. Steve Russell, who probably weighed 400 pounds, was an activist on campus, and he went downtown and marched down the middle of Congress. And there's a photo of him, Stevens, with police, police motorcycles on all sides of it. Somewhere that's in archives. I'd love to see. What happened with respect to the march, though, is that I got a call from George Shotsky, who was an old friend who was on the law school faculty, and he said that UT law students had drafted a pleading. He was going to file it that day or the next day in federal court for Judge Roberts, and would I sign on to the pleading? The pleading was going to require the city council, Austin City Council, to issue a parade permit to the it wasn't the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, I can't remember. Student Mobilization Committee, I think, was probably the principal at that time. And I said, sure. And we go over to the federal court. This is the first time I think I saw, there were a number of students there. They had walkie-talkies talking back and forth, apparently, from the foyer of the courtroom to the people gathered out on campus. But City of Austin showed up, and we got up and said a few things to Judge Roberts. Nobody said much of anything in terms of lawyering. Of course, the first thing to know about Judge Roberts is he knew every leaf that fell in Austin politically. I mean, so it was not as if he had to be informed on anything. He had his ear to the ground all over. But we made our little presentation. The judge was also very gruff and kind of mumbled a bit. He mumbled something. And George said to me, sitting at counsel, "What did he say?" I said, "Hell, I don't know. Get up and ask him." And so George got back up and said, "Your Honor, I'm sorry to say, but I didn't understand your ruling." And Judge Roberts said, "I said they could march." It's just that simple. And my office was up in the Texas AFL-CIO building. And God, I remember leaving the courthouse, rushing to my office, unloading my briefcase and everything else. So I was able to get in the march. And it was one of the most exhilarating days I guess I ever remember it. And one or more of the somewhat ironic things is, of course, there were motorcycles, there were Austin police on all sides over there, kind of sitting back. Lo and behold, some of them actually gave us the peace sign as we came by. So transformational moment in Austin politics, just in the sense that students felt empowered. It wasn't very long before we began to win political battles in Austin, and so it was fun. I just felt so lucky to have been involved in it, truthfully.
Yeah, and in such an immediate way, like when the judges saying "let them march," like they're already marching, and
they were on the way. As I say, they had a walkie-talkie, and they went out and said, "You can start." And I guess somehow or another, the police were told they had to pull back, and there they came.
And you're absolutely right. Like a lot of people who were in the streets that day went on to become civic leaders in the city of Austin. It seems like a real turning point looking back.
Oh yeah, no, I think it had real political implications. Well, of course, the city council at that point was basically just a bunch of Chamber of Commerce people who worried about the Austin image. They didn't want anything to offend Lyndon Johnson, having a bunch of anti-war people running around down here in Austin.
When the Armadillo World Headquarters comes around, another one of the connections there, Eddie, you often tell the story of Bud Shrake was one of the ones who was influential in naming it the Armadillo World Headquarters, because one of your ideas was to call it the Armadillo National Headquarters.
National Guard Armory, so, it seemed natural to... National's not a real popular word right now.
Yeah. Shrake was the most, in some ways, improbable personality, but he was a fountain of ideas.
Yeah.
Among other things.
Well, he also, because of that Sports Illustrated job that he held down in New York while living in Austin, was one of the better paid people.
It was about going to have a job,
Yeah, writing me a $1,000 check back in those days would be like $100,000 check now. And I was just dumbfounded.
Right.
Well, tell us a little bit about who the Mad Dogs are.
Well, they were sort of a fluctuating group. Mad Dogs. Gary Cartwright actually had printed up some cards.
Yeah.
He would hand them out to people, and they became all honorary Mad Dogs. But the basic Mad Dog crowd was was Pete Gent, the former Dallas cowboy and author, and Shrake, Cartwright, and they came to get me because I was the mad dog lawyer. It was not one that required a great deal of activity. Sort of like I was a lawyer for Armadillo, and I don't recall ever doing a damn thing for Armadillo except incorporating the thing. And I think I incorporated Mad Dog Inc. too. We did that, but that's about the extent of my legal act.
Eddie, what are some of your memories of the Mad Dogs?
Well, I remember when Jerry Jeff pulled up to the front door of the Raw Deal right after I had sold the Raw Deal to Fletcher and Lopez. They wanted all of my advice, and I put it on a yellow pad and did about half a page. The first rule was make a deposit every day. But then I saw Jerry Jeff pulling up in his Mercedes, and I had Fletcher whip out a sign before he could get from the end of the block where he parked to the door. Fletcher had written what I told him to on this piece of cardboard box that we tore off about this long, so it covered just the front of the front door, and said, "No guitars, leave them in the car."
It'll be better next time.
Well, that was what from Mr. Hamby at the Hofbrau.
Right.
I came back one night with his friend had said, "I can't eat a bite on the whole plate. It's all gristle." Mr. Hamby said, "It'll be better next time," and threw the plate in the dishwasher. And so they put that on the door as the motto. It was a limited menu. I did everything I could to make it easy. As a matter of fact, David told me that by getting Fletcher and Lopez jobs, I had a free pass to get into heaven, but they didn't keep the jobs long enough for me to qualify.
Anything to get them off the streets, yeah.
Yeah. Talk about deer in the headlights. But they had found the place before I did and wanted to have the Mad Dog Bar and Grill there. And then I found it and not know anything about their plans, but I found it and I thought it was just perfect. I was trying to sneak away from the Armadillo, have something to do. And so I had this idea about having the Raw Deal. And you found the Raw Deal. Raw Deal didn't come looking for you. And it broke Fletcher's heart, but I said I'm gonna do it, but I'm not doing your deal. I'm doing the Raw Deal. He let me have it, and I think the rent was $120 a month, which was about all he could afford. It really was.
It was down on Sabine Street, wasn't it?
Yeah, Sabine Street. It was a Mexican joint called Rosie's at one point, and with horrible murals on the wall of Indians scalping the white women in their chest. But it was small enough to, I could outshout anybody in a place that small. I just gave it to Fletcher and Lopez after I got it started. And they would have these screaming matches on Friday night. They would have to get together and they would have these arguments. And you couldn't understand anybody because they were all shouting at each other so loud.
They had a shoe shine stand on the outside of it where you could sit outdoors on the shoe shine stand. And they decided if you sat out there and smoked dope, no one would bother you. So that was a fairly routine use of the shoe shine.
Yeah, it was off in the dark. Sabine Street was real short there. And it was right close to the highway, but at the end of the street coming from Congress, so that there was nothing going on in the first couple of blocks. The Texas Monthly women had been there about 2 or 3 weeks, and they all of a sudden discovered the Raw Deal, and it was in a real scary place for women to be alone, but because I was there, they weren't really alone. The Raw Deal was going to come out in the New Texas Monthly, and the Raw Deal was a hot new place to go. And I wouldn't serve them until they promised to go back to the office and take it out. Because that broke all of my motto about no advertising. So Betty Moore went back to the office and took it out of the magazine. Mike Levy heard about that and has hated my guts ever since.
Well, I thought you've told me once that the way you dealt with Mike is you pretend he think he's Mark Katz.
That's right. Oh, yeah. That was what really pissed both of them off. Right. Yeah, the Raw Deal was a sanctuary of sorts for a year or so for me. Because when I left the Armadillo, I really had my tail between my legs. Been kicked around all I cared to, and having 100 employees and all those thousands of people to be responsible for wore me out, and the Raw Deal was just about the right size.
Well, it turned into a real happening place ultimately.
It did. It was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. A lot of people had a whole lot of fun there.
Too much sometime, I think. Well, one of my favorite stories, there was a wonderful, Terry Dubose was a very big anti-war activist who typically drank in the later days at the Raw Deal, and decided one night had probably had too much to drink and decided to walk home. He lived up above UT campus, and so he walked down and got in the creek and thought he could just walk home in the creek. Unfortunately, he ended up, of course, in the parking lot of the Austin police station, where he was arrested. That's the kind of classic, I think, Raw Deal story.
Seemed like Terry was the one that took Jane Fonda to Scholz Garden and hit her out when there was a death threat. She came to the Armadillo for a protest of some sort, and there was a death threat.
But yeah, he ran the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and I think you're right about that.
The one job that I would have died for, he just swept right up and took off with it. And he and Jane went to Scholz Garden and locked themselves in and waited for the boogeymen, but they never came.
Lucky that Scholz Garden plays a large role in the lore of Austin as this, like, the seed bed of that oppositional kind of rebellious culture, and you were at some of those tables, Dave, very early on. Can you tell us a little bit about Scholz Garden in those days? It would later be fictionalized by Billy Lee Brammer, but what was the real thing like?
Well, it was a welcoming place. I don't think I discovered it during my first round at the UT. I think by the time I don't think I even went there when I was in law school. Over the years, it was always a watering hole whenever I was in Austin for any legal or political activity. And you go there, and there was always a fairly welcoming table. Largely Henry Holman, who was the president of the Carpenters Union, and
Mary.
And his wonderful wife, Mary, who was a nurse at Brackenridge.
In the emergency room.
Yeah, I guess that's
where she came from with bloody scrub after Whitman and the Towers.
The truth of the matter is there were a number of years there that every visiting liberal Democrat in Texas would always swing by and stop for at Scholz Garden as being a welcoming spot. So you could count on a lot of visiting firemen who came in to sit down with you at the big table, and it was a big table, and included. One of the more interesting things was Lewis Buck, who was a veterinarian. He was the only vet who made house calls. So the story has always been out that he's the source for Billy Brammer. When he ran out of speed, Lewis would take him doggy pet pills to keep him going, and that was part of his house calls. Wayne Oates was always there till way late in the evening. Ann and I would take the kids there on Friday night, and they'd run around in the garden, and we'd sit and drink beer. Then came liquor by the drink. The old garden sort of shut down in terms of what it once was. The Raw Deal came along, and it sort of, became more of the hangout place than the garden for our crowd. As I recall, when Ann got elected county commissioner, we swore her in at Raw Deal. And I think at the same time, we swore Eddie Wilson in as president of the Musicians Union, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
I've never been convinced that it was a real thing. I thought it was a bedtime story that people told to scare their children, and yet we have people who might possibly have eyewitness accounts of the Flying Zas. Can you tell me a little bit about whether that was an actual thing?
Well, if you ever could have actual things emerge from Shrake and Cartwright and Jerry Jeff Walker, but it's hard to even conceive of it being actual. But indeed, Ann and I had a very significant visit from the Flying Zas. They were in their capes and their tights, and they showed up. Ann and I had gone to a Christmas party the night before at Cartwright's place, and Ann had been in her Santa Claus outfit. And about 7 in the morning, the Zas were still partying, I think, but they'd run out of pills to keep them going. And at some point, they concluded that a pharmacy wouldn't turn down Santa Claus if Santa Claus came in to make a purchase. And so they showed up at our house, as I say, in costume, got Ann up. She dutifully put on her Santa Claus outfit, and we drove down, or they drove us all down to a pharmacy there on Guadalupe. Ann went in her outfit to buy some more uppers, I suppose, or whatever, keep them going. And lo and behold, they turned her down. Then it was decided they could go wake up Dr. Feelgood. And, Jack, in any event, so we drove over to somewhere in Terrytown, I guess it was, and Dr. Feelgood did provide some script for what they needed. And then once they were rejuvenated, we went over to Shrake's house. By then, I think the Punzar groupies had joined them, so we had a larger crowd. And after a little bit of activity, they decided to demonstrate their most famous triple. This was all based on what was the movie? I don't remember now the movie, but I think Burt Lancaster was in it. But whatever. It turned out that the triple in their case was diving over Shrake's couch and ending up on the floor. And they performed that. And that was the last sighting I ever had of the Punzars in costume. That was some years back.
I've heard a story so clearly told that I think I've seen it. It's a movie quality piece, but it's that they went into somebody's party to clear out a space for the performance. It called for Jerry Jeff to squat down and hold his hands right in front of him like this as a step, and Jap was to run across the room and put his foot in Jerry Jeff's cupped hands. Jerry Jeff would then push him up in the air, and Jap would do his flip. And everything went really well until Jap charged at Jerry Jeff and left the floor and planted his foot in the middle of Jerry Jeff's chest. And they went over. There was a drum kit set up behind them in a bandstand, and they destroyed the drum kit on the bandstand. And but I don't think there was any witness to him actually taking flight.
Well, I know when they came to our house, my son Dan was probably 11 or 12 years old. He was asleep, and then Jerry Jeff came in there playing a ukulele or something, and Dan came out and said, "There's some old drunk in my bedroom." That was the family experience with the
It seems like a dangerous business having a gymnast troupe performing under these conditions.
Yeah, and it was, I think, highly dangerous.
It makes one at this point wish there had been more cell phone cameras back then.
Yeah.
Some of the great pictures that'll never be taken can't be redone.
I think I told you, I don't know, I wrote about it, I think, trying to represent Shrake and Cartwright in a lawsuit against Cliff Robertson. Cliff Robertson wanted to do a rodeo movie, I guess it was. And they put together a script and turned it over to Robertson. He said it was just terrible, but then he made the movie and didn't ever pay him. And they came to me to file suit against him. But the problem was Warren Burnett, who was the great trial lawyer of that era, had promised he would try the lawsuit if I'd just file it. So I filed it, and then Warren disappeared on me, got caught up in something else. So suddenly I had the damn lawsuit in my lap. I said, I need to see the correspondence that you all have had with Robertson. And Jap brought down this bundle of stuff, and I began to leaf through it. And I saw this letter from Shrake to Cliff Robertson enclosing a newspaper headline, "Man beaten to death with frozen dog." And I said to Jap, "Well, did Bud send this to Robertson?" And Jap kind of went dead silent on me on that one. Well, it turns out that indeed he did send it. And when we got started in the lawsuit, turns out that Robertson had come back convinced that he'd been caught up with a Manson-type gang, and when he got in with Shrake and Cartwright.
That was because of a trip. They brought him to my house.
Oh, did they?
They brought him to my house and just, pointed shit on the walls and told stories, and he was supposed to be known as Biff.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't want anybody to know who he was, so for his anonymity, he wanted to be Biff.
That's right. I ended up in the court of Judge Matthews, who I had opposed in private practice, and he called me a dirty Teamster lawyer. So it was not a particularly favorable working relationship with the judge in the case. And then get a jury in the box, and it's pretty middle class Austin juries. And right in just about morning break, Larry King shows up, the writer Larry King, and his big beard and funny clothes, and three bimbo chicks, all in mini skirts, all of whom run up and begin to hug Jap and Bud, and the jurors are going out looking like this. So it seemed to me at that point we were probably on the wrong course, but the end of the day had not gone very well, and Jap and Bud had only gotten themselves some clothes. They had tight. I made them wear ties, and of course they were just sweating all over it, so full of speed. And I said, "Now you all got to be back here tomorrow morning at 9." And they look at me dumbfounded. What do you mean we got to go back? There was a settlement on the table, not much of one, but there was a settlement on the table that they decided to take that and spare themselves and says, "You're getting dressed up again and coming to court." What a pair.
Dave, you mentioned briefly the Weather Underground, and one thing I wanted to ask you kind of about is the experience in the late 60s and the early 70s of being a liberal who had been very involved in politics, already been through a lot of these battles, and then you see this new generation of folks who are both very excited and engaged, but often exasperating, I would imagine. What it's like to be a liberal movement lawyer with the rise of radicals and the counterculture. So you were involved in a lot of very important cases with the RAG and the Chuck Wagon 21 and meeting with SDS type folks out in Wimberley and that kind of thing. Could you tell us a little bit about those experiences, how you got kind of pulled into that world a little bit?
And I moved back to Austin in 1969. We'd been here about a month, and I get a call on a Sunday at the house. This young voice says, "Professor Shotsky told me I could call you. Can the University of Texas ban the RAG from the UT campus?" And I said, "Of course not. Don't worry about that. Thank you." Hung up. Of course, within the space of a week, Frank Irwin was the chairman of the Board of Regents then, and sued in state court many of the principals of the RAG, figures that they could identify. I guess I got called back in and sued the regents to enjoin the prosecution of the state litigation, state lawsuit, state district court lawsuit, and I guess to avoid the injunction that the state judge had issued. And so that began what was, I guess, 7 or 8 years, I guess, of litigation. Once or twice to the Supreme Court. Actually won the damn case in the trial court, surprisingly. Then by the time it was all, the regents changed their rules and claimed we could do the RAG on campus. And by the time we won it, of course, the RAG had disappeared. That'd be so classic, that all the people who'd done it had wandered off by then, and so I didn't have anybody much to report to of this success.
Which is saying a lot, because the RAG was one of the longest lived of those underground papers, so it must have been a long time.
Born essentially to some degree by new crowd, not new crowd, the same old crowd, as a matter of fact, to some degree. Alice Embry still at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And,
Gordon's still in there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that was kind of fun. I took Frank Irwin's deposition during the course of that, and I thought I was going to really nail his ass. I'd known Frank somewhat because I had been a Kappa Sig at the university, which was his main love. He just charmed me almost out of my pants in the deposition. He said, it made me feel so sorry for him. He says, "I'm trying to explain to all my alumni out there why we have this stuff going on campus down here, and I'm trying to save the university. placate these alumni. And by the time it was over with, I didn't get anywhere. I was just a total waste of time trying to nail Frank down. He was much too slick for me.
How did you feel about this young wave of activism? You again have been in the trenches of democratic politics since, it sounds like the late 50s, right? And then you have this sort of new wave and this new blood. Was it something that was really exciting and you felt like it was the next chapter, or were you counseling patients?
Radical Lawyers Conference, as we called it, or I think that's what the FBI called it in our dossiers, conjured up by Fred the Red Cohen on the law school faculty and that great Austin activist Martin Wigington. And Martin had been his finger in everything. He's a wonderful, engaging guy. They got hold of me and asked me would I be one of the lawyer sponsors of the thing. And I said, well, sure. And I recruited, I don't know, a half a dozen other lawyers. Maury Maverick Jr., I remember I got, and a couple of Fred Weldon, I think, many, a few others. Oh, and Warren Burnett, number one, Warren Burnett. And Kunstler's there. Bernadine Dorn is there. Some people out of the Black Panthers and some just old hippies and stoners. The whole theory was we were going to have a conversation between lawyers like such as I and these we had recruited and the radical movement to see if we could reach some accommodation where we could do the cases for them. So that was the whole thing. Well, of course, it turned into chaos immediately. I somehow felt my part. I finally saw that it was going nowhere in the mass meeting. I said, well, let's split up. Activists over here can meet and talk and see what you're going to do, and I'll take the lawyers in, and we'll go see if we can come up with some statement of position, make it possible for us to have a dialogue. And so we get in there, and there must have been a dozen lawyers or so. One of them, wonderful fellow from Killeen, Davis Bragg. We get in there, get to chatting, and Davis says, well, I practice law in Killeen. I make a living that way, and I'm sort of happy to try to be helpful to these people on my own terms. But he said, I can't call the district judge sitting in Bell County a racist pig, because that's going to kind of make it impossible for me to continue to practice law there. And there was sort of general agreement on that and some discussion. And then Warren Burnett, who always was the most articulate of all, said, well, I think I have the sense of the meeting. I say that, as I understand it, we want to tell these young people foregathered here that we will be available to represent them on our own terms, in our own way, and if that's not satisfactory, fuck them. And it fell my part to go back and tell the assembled crowd that was the result of the lawyers' concurrence. If they didn't like it, fuck them. And that was the sort of the end of the Radical Lawyers Conference. Except it got us all, as I say, both in the got my FBI files and my CIA files. It was prominent among the items in there that described my past.
It was the National Lawyers Guild that was held in Armadillo.
Yeah, I remember that. I went to that one. I was there
a couple of times, I think.
That was sort of the high water mark of the culture coming together.
So going back a little bit through this, thinking about the RAG and thinking about your Dallas days too, I want to talk a little bit about who Stoney Burns is and how he figures into some of these stories to bring that Dallas point of view in.
Well, I was still practicing law in Dallas when Stoney he was publishing the Dallas Notes, which was, I guess, a classic underground newspaper that extolled smoking pot and sex and all those things, and totally offended the Dallas establishment. He lived over in East Dallas in an old kind of hippie crash pad where he wrote, where he put his paper together, and the police came out and executed a search warrant for obscenity based on an issue of the Dallas Notes. And the part I loved about it, I guess this came out in his deposition, that the cops came roaring in and read him this warrant. And he said, well, let's see what the chairman has to say about this. And got out the little red book, quoted that. to the police, but that didn't slow him down. They took everything he had, and took typewriters, took his clothes, took just about everything, and he came to Texas Civil Liberties Union, and I guess that ended up at Mullinex Wells, where I was practicing law, and I ended up with the case. So I sued the Dallas police chief, Dyson, and some others, and filed suit, and ended up in Sarah Hughes' court, who was a sitting federal judge there. It couldn't have been a more favorable venue than Sarah Hughes, who immediately, I don't know when she issued an order or by whoever came in to represent the city, agreed to it without ever even having to have a hearing, that they'd return all of Stoney's stuff. And so we sat out there, Stoney and I did, on the front stoop of his pad, and watched all these people lug all his shit back into our house. Then I guess it went to the Supreme Court twice, I guess. Same sort of experience.
And he originally had a very long sentence that you helped get reduced, right?
Oh, no. They were still after him, but after this round, there was a drug bust later when I guess Henry Wade was still district attorney, and they found a joint or a roach in his car, probably planted, indicted him for marijuana possession. I wasn't involved in the case. The jury gave him 10 years to do. The case was on appeal, I guess. Shortly thereafter, Briscoe, there was a whole change of striking felony convictions for minor possession of marijuana. And Stoney never served a day on that one. Somewhere or another, that all got washed out. And of course, by the time I won his other case, he quit publishing too. So it just
Stoney had a little bit of a cloud that he ran from all the time, but came up to me in Panther Hall. She was doing a show in that old bowling alley. We were playing the whole day instead of having 3 or 4 bands to split it with, because Spencer, to go up there, wanted to try to make some money. Longest day of my life. And all these little kids were all over that old dance hall bowling alley conversion thing. And it's where Willie did, that wonderful live album, Live at Panther Hall. Spencer was finally playing. They were rocking out on the stage, and spotted Stoney sitting in the crowd, and went up and knelt down beside him. Stoney handed me a hit of acid, and I was trying to hand him a joint. At the exact instant, they were both right here, fully visible, with a tap, tap, tap on my shoulder. I turned around and looked, and there was a police pistol and a holster and a black stripe on a pair of pants going right to the floor. And I thought, oh, shit, this is as bad as I've ever been caught. And I look up, and this old security guy, whether he was a cop or not, I don't really know for sure, said, are you Wilson? Yes, sir. He said, they said you're in charge. Would you get up there on that stage and make these kids quit dancing? We don't have a license for them to dance. They're not old enough. And I'm sitting here with my acid and a joint and his gun right there. And I said, yeah, I'll take care of it. No problem. And you just had to adjust the best you could, do what had to be done.
Well, when I argued it in the U.S. Supreme Court, I do remember decided that the best thing to do was to try to get the court's attention. They were all focused off on a procedural issue, that is basically whether a federal court could enjoin the state prosecution. We got caught up there, argued it the first time, and it split 4-4. I was arguing that we weren't trying to enjoin the prosecution. We were just trying to declare the damn statute unconstitutional. And Nixon finally got got an appointment of Blackmun, so they get Blackmun on the court, and we go back to re-argue the case, and that was the second time around.
So you got after state obscenity laws. One of the other big ones that I appreciate from that period of time, or a little bit earlier actually, is the loyalty oath. For you.
Oh, yeah. Now, I really spared the University of Texas a lot of misery and a lot of cost, as a matter of fact, with that lawsuit. Well, in any event, this case began with Ev Gilmore, who was a tuba player in the Dallas Symphony. And Ev taught the tuba couple of days, hours a week at Dallas Community College. When he'd been there for a week or so, they presented him with the loyalty oath. It had this long list of organizations, none of which you could belong to. And he said, well, I'm not going to sign that. And he was fired and didn't get his $50 or whatever it was he was due. So I filed suit on that.
Later than I think most people think of it, because it's a legacy of McCarthyism and Cold War, but this is sort of late 60s.
The list was a list that had been generated out of the McCarthy era of suspect organizations, and it was a laundry list, of course, the IWW and Gold Star Mothers, all kinds of crazy shit. But it was a U.S. Attorney General's list of subversive organizations or potentially subversive organizations. In any event, I filed suit, and by this point, the Dallas Community College was getting ready to capitulate and abandon the oath and give Ev his $50 or something. But I didn't want to give up on my lawsuit. And by this time, I'm in Austin, and I'm trying to find another plaintiff. Lo and behold, a new plaintiff appeared from the law school, a young man named Tom Mantle, who had been hired at the law school by Roy Mirsky to shelve books in the law school library. And I've always thought Mirsky probably had planned this, but in any event, they handed him the loyalty oath thing. And he said, well, I can't sign this. I'm a member of the IWW, the Wobblies. Back there, and then radicals were always, you could still get a radical card or IWW card. I think there's a chapter in Seattle or something for $1.50 or something. You could get yourself a Wobbly card. Mantle had done that. So I added him to the lawsuit, and suddenly we had a viable plaintiff, and we knocked out the loyalty oath at the University of Texas. So when I first went to UT, and I expect Eddie had the same experience. I don't know. You go through the goddamn registration over there in that horrible experience at the gymnasium, and then the last thing you did was the whole bank of notary publics where they'd confront you with the loyalty oath, and you'd have to sign it as part of the registration process. We knocked that out, I think, but I never get any thank you notes from Frank Irwin or any of those people at the time. That's to my surprise. The great thing to remember, or I've always thought, well, in terms of the energizing of the Hispanic community, labor played a huge role. First, of course, here in Austin was the economy furniture strike, which resulted in, among other things, Richard Moya coming into public office. And the Teamsters had a Teamster president who was in the Crystal City Revolution in South Texas, or in Crystal City. So there was a real role played around here, and of course in politics too. But
and the UFW too, like a real backbone of that movement.
Mm-hmm.
In the Valley.
Oh yeah.
You, Dave, kind of came into this world of law as it seems like a labor lawyer first, which for me, those are kind of magic words. It sounds like Knights of the Round Table. And yet when people learn their Texas history, 7th grade Texas history, organized labor and labor unions almost never come up. I teach Texas history at the college level, and I usually have to start by explaining what a union is, right? It's not a common sense thing. It's been kind of removed from people's vocabulary. And yet it's pivotal to understanding so much of, especially 20th century Texas history and politics. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a labor lawyer and the role that you see labor unions playing in a lot of these political struggles and events that you were witness to?
Well, how I came to be one is that I was getting out of law school, and it dawned on me that I probably had to go get a job. And all my contemporaries seemed to, all they wanted to do was represent insurance companies or banks and things, and I knew I wasn't going to do that. I got briefly recruited by the CIA. That's what I was going to go do. After sort of a strange encounter in D.C. with some guru who we talked about Thomas Wolfe. We talked about Thomas Wolfe about, but the CIA decided I wasn't fit material for them, and so I was back in the business of job hunting. In those days, they posted on the bulletin board at the law school job openings, and I walked by one day and it said, labor law firm in Dallas representing unions is looking for a lawyer. It dawned on me for the first time that maybe I could practice law, because that was about the only, I had worked with enough labor people in politics already that I thought that sounded doable. It proved challenging for sure. The first year I was there was the year Hoffa got crossways with Bobby Kennedy. And so the first years there were Teamster battles with everybody in the world. So it was a fairly exciting time and stressful time. It was an interesting firm, a very left-wing, the only left-wing operation in Dallas pretty much. We were a pariah in the community by and large. Remember, the police union was going to hire us because they needed a lawyer. It was charged that we were all communists, and so they voted not to hire us as their law firm at that time. And this was Dallas, as I said, at its peak of right-wing lunacy. But there is some history, of course, of labor in Texas. It goes all the way back to the great strike in Marshall when they closed down, I guess it's Jay Gould's was that had the line, and they struck in Marshall and shut him down totally for a good while. So that goes back to fairly early.
Yeah, like 1885, 1886 in that area, yeah. And
of course, then there was the cowboy strike in the Panhandle, which may be mythical or may not. I heard both versions, but that there was a period of time that the cowboys struck out there over whatever, I can't remember, whether they wanted more food or better food or something, I'm not sure. Up until then, of course, when I first got into politics, the Steelworkers Union was big along the Gulf Coast, and of course the oil workers were in the Beaumont, Jefferson County, and to some extent Galveston County were fairly serious labor strongholds at that point. They played a significant role in state politics, and if you teach it, you know it. Whole anti-shivers movement came out of a coalition of labor, African Americans, Hispanics, disenfranchised liberals, so whatever you want to call them. So the formation by Frankie Randolph of the various competing organizations to the state Democratic Party, and were the backbone of the early Yarborough movement, Ralph Yarborough campaigns. There was that history, and it continued fairly viable up until, I don't know, automation killed some of it. Oh, and I used to represent the Garment Workers Union, and there were all kinds of sewing plants, garment plants in Texas at that time. And all of that ended up in Mexico or China or someplace. And they totally disappeared. But the ILG, International Lady Garment Workers Union, was a fairly vigorous union here in Texas when I first started practicing law.
And thinking of the evolution of democratic politics in the state, once the liberals kind of found a basis to compete for power within the party, it was that intersection of labor and civil rights and the liberals, and labor was so important to that. I think that often gets forgotten or taken off by the wayside.
They were much involved in the farm workers' operation in the valley, and the famous La Marcha for the minimum wage that occupied a great deal of energy and attention.
There were John Connolly went down in the limo to meet him.
It was Connolly? I guess it was Connolly who tried to get him not to. It didn't work. I guess I was still in Dallas. I drove down to finish up the march with them. I think I brought Ron Clower with me, I don't guess he was in the Senate then yet, but getting ready to be. It was a great event. And I may even been productive.
We sure did have a lot of fun with all of those things at Armadillo. Voter registration, any excuse to give a party, and we'd been using ballet, and then all of a sudden here were these elections. They're all supposed to have people attached to them. Anything to get them in here.
Did you have to be convinced of that? Did you want to steer clear of the political at first, or was that embraced pretty early on?
I never thought about any such thing, remotely from any direction happening in my life that would cause me to be, an official, an elected official. But all of a sudden I was one. We sworn in at the raw deal with Ann as county commissioner, and I was sworn in, and Virginia Witten's swearing in of Ann at the raw deal. Most hilarious single bit of prose I've ever heard. And I can't remember anything about it except my ribs ached so bad from laughing so hard. Virginia was just absolutely fabulous.
Mm-hmm. She was.
And those were friends from the Dallas days, were the Whittens?
The Whittens were in Dallas, and Eddie would have met them there.
Yeah, I met them at that same big old party I met you at after Ramblin' Jack and Mance played at the Coca-Cola Auditorium.
In the early days, we always spent Friday nights at Scholz Garden, and Virginia decided that that was non-productive, and she was going to start something called First Fridays. So she and Sam, we'd have a gathering at their house on First Fridays. And at that point, that was an interesting collective. That we had, John Henry Falk was a regular, Russell Lee was a regular, Conrad Fath and Shooty Fath, Shooty's recent tuba player, Ev Gilmore from the Loyalty Oath lawsuit would come and play the tuba sometime. So it was kind of fun.
That does sound like quite a group. Yeah, I mean, people like Russell Lee and John Henry Falk talk about, generations and, reaching back and having this influence.
Yeah.
Molly was a regular. And so after the Whittens quit, Molly Ivan started up some years later, tried to run it herself at First Friday, and I think fairly successfully. But it was a nice cross-generational thing between John Henry and Russell. The storytelling could go on pretty much forever. Old stories, they had them for sure.
Some of the most consistent struggles that you've been engaged in involve the intersection of voting rights and redistricting and race, and it's hard to even wrap my head around all of the different important moments in Texas legal history that you've been involved in on that score. I wonder if you could share with us what you thought some of the highlights were, some of the ways that you did really change things, if anything else. The idea of voting rights and redistricting remains right at the front of our consciousness.
It sure does. Well, I sort of stumbled into it. The main case was a case called White versus Regester. Mark White was the Secretary of State at the time, and the lawsuit basically was a challenge in the legislature, the at-large electoral districts. That is, at that point in time, for example, I can't remember the exact number, Harris County, Houston had elected, I think, maybe 25 or 30 House members, all from county-wide. And Dallas had, I think, 27 or so in that number. And the theory was, in effect, disadvantaged or excluded the minority communities, basically the Black communities, to some degree the Hispanic community. And so it was jointly done with MALDEF, that's the American Legal Defense and Education Fund, with a lawyer named Eddie Darr. As I have acknowledged from time to time, and even taught it at the law school, that venue is the single most important aspect of the practice of law. That is, you find a place or a judge that you want to be in front of, and that's when you make a lot of very serious decisions. So obviously in that era, you wanted to be in front of Wayne Justice. So when I decided to file the lawsuit, I called my old friend Bill Kugel, who practiced law in Athens, and at one time had actually practiced law with Wayne in private practice. And he said, I need a plaintiff that lives in the Tyler Division of the Eastern District. And he called me back and said, there's a woman named Diane Regester. You can use her as a plaintiff. So the case became Diane Regester versus Mark White. Went twice, I guess, to the U.S. Supreme Court. I never met or spoke to Diane Regester. And I don't know if she ever knew anything about this case. But in all events, it proved to be ultimately most significant at the time and continues to be a fairly viable legal precedent in terms of voting rights. But the end result of it was that single-member districts were created in Dallas, Houston, and Bexar County, San Antonio. It produced, among other people, Craig Washington and Mickey Leland, Paul Ragsdale, who's an African-American from Dallas, actually Eddie Bernice Johnson, who's still, I guess, much on the scene. So it was a bit of a revolution. And I think I wrote about it and told the story, but I love it so, that Craig Washington, Mickey Leland, and Benny Reyes, I believe, they show up at the Capitol, driving some old Chevrolet down there, go up on the Capitol driveway, and one of those wonderful old guards comes out and says, "Well, what you boys looking for?" And well, we're looking for a place to park. Well, they said, "Boys, this is just reserved for members of the Texas legislature." And Craig Washington responded, "Well, boss, Williams is members of the Texas legislature," which has always been my favorite story. And that did create a bit of change.
Yeah, it really revolutionized representation of African Americans and Mexican Americans in the state legislature, where you just watch those numbers. Yeah, it explodes almost immediately. And if you had written in a script that the case was white versus Regester before Judge Justice, the editor would probably say no one would believe that. White versus Regester and Judge Justice.
Yeah.
Of course, the interesting thing is that the Republican Party, through Tom G., was also on our side at that point, because they were essentially excluded in Dallas because of the conservative Democrats dominated the whole scene there. And so they were with us for a short while. They didn't stay hitched all that long, but they had the same sort of stake in the game, and it did obviously produce significant Republican office holders too in Dallas and elsewhere.
It remains so relevant. I wonder if that does that feel rewarding that people are still fighting the fight, or is there some disappointment that the fights are still there? It's something I'm always wrestling with myself. What are some of the lessons that you might pass on to the people who are working today in voting rights or civil rights? Or
hang on to your hat, because you're fixing to get screwed again, it looks like to me. I mean, when the Supreme Court kicked out Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, they just knocked a huge hole in voting protections. Unless it can be resurrected this time around in some form, you're going to see all these Republican states, in effect, disenfranchised effectively poor and minority voters. It's happening here in Texas. It's happening, as you know, we all know, all across the South. Restricting the franchise has always been a tool of whomever the conservative Democrats did it when they were in charge of Texas. Their successors, Republicans, are doing it here, and we'll continue to. And then, of course, we're going to get gerrymandered all to hell this time around.
I believe you have a quote in your book, which came out several years ago, but seems like it could have been written, just today, about the long tradition of conservatives claiming voting improprieties among poor and racial minorities, despite the fact that there's no evidentiary evidence.
None. Yeah, it's just a belief that they can't lose. If they do lose, there must be some criminal involvement somewhere producing it.
Yeah. So maybe the lesson isn't about how to achieve the victory, it's how to stay in the fight, right? Like that's the hardest part, maybe, to keep your courage up, to keep doing it.
You just get pissed off. That's.
Can you share with us a little bit more about, is it William Wayne Justice?
Well, it was just damn serious. I did a lot of cases in front of it. I mean, he'd work your tail off to do it right. I mean, he was serious. I did have some sort of voting case, I guess. Don't remember which one it was. And we took a break at lunch. Only one place to eat at Tyler was the Businessman's Club or some damn thing. The lawyer on the other side was from the Texas Attorney General's office. And so I went over there with my colleagues, who I guess at that point was George Corbel. Lonnie Zwiener, who was the state's lawyer, was over there at a additional table, and some of Judge Justice's law clerks were over there at a different table. Turns out Zwiener's attracted some local heavy right-wingers to sit at the table with him, and he's over there bad-mouthing Wayne Justice, and much to their delight, because they hated him there. But unfortunately for Zwiener, one of the law clerks overheard Zwiener doing that. So we get back from lunch and go into the courtroom, and you could see that Wayne Justice was just seething with anger. And so it was not a good day for Zwiener after that at all. It wasn't going to be a good day anyway for him, probably. That cost him a little bit. Wayne Justice was a liberal Democrat from East Texas, and that was fairly, there were plenty of them at that point. They were still old Roosevelt Democrats, and Many of them were lawyers, and there were a goodly number of them scattered all over East Texas at that point. But they're dying breed now over there, for sure.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of those cases take you into East Texas at that time.
Well, then I decided to go after county commissioners. I thought I could take the theory of single-member districts and what I'd learned and try to get black elected county commissioners in East Texas. So what I did was I tried to identify every county in Wayne Justice's venue where there was a 25% black population. In my sort of primitive mathematics, I thought if I could probably have 25% black population, I could probably draw a black county commissioner district. And of course, I filed 2 or 3 lawsuits, and Wayne immediately put them for trial. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I was not even prepared, really. But first one was in Nacogdoches County, and Paul Ragsdale had an assistant named Jim Klein, who was a classic hippie, long beard, long hair, and he was a mathematician of sorts. He'd been working at Texas Instruments, as he said, in Dallas, but then he got to smoking wiggly cigarettes, as he called them, and lost his job and moved to Austin. He was my expert witness. And of course, the county commissioners were here they all sitting there in Nacogdoches, all these white rednecks sitting there on the front row, and there's Klein testifying, and they're in front of Wayne Justice, and you could tell they thought that all hell had fallen on their head. And it had, by the way, but at the end of the day, Wayne had ordered, at the end of the case, he ordered a new precinct, and the first black county commissioner, we think, since Reconstruction was elected in Nacogdoches County after that. So, it made a difference. We followed up with some other cases. And then we did city councils too. Did the Waco City Council, turned it into a single-member districts, and that was my hometown, and so it was kind of fun to go do it there.
So here we are, organized labor in coalition with civil rights movement and liberals had started to push the Democratic Party a little bit, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. In the 70s, too, some of the remnants or veterans of the anti-war left had in some ways taken over the Austin City Council. It goes liberal in the mid-1970s. We have voting rights, changing representation, and there seems to be this sort of building wave of what you call sort of the Yarborough Democrats, people who are sort of forged in that wing of the party. And then in the 80s and the 90s, you really see those coalitions start to bear some fruit. So I wanted to know if we could talk a little bit about politics in the 80s and 90s in Austin and in Texas, and the role that both of you played, or the sort of versions that you had of it, Anne's coming into politics. So what are some of sort of big, broad thoughts on the politics of the 80s in Texas?
I don't know. I would say first, since you mentioned it, I think I mentioned it before, that the economy furniture strike here in Austin sort of revolutionized the Hispanic community on the east side. They linked up registering to vote and voting with the strikers. And as I said, they were instrumental in getting Richard Moya elected. That was a critical strike. And of course, the shuttle bus workers' strike was mainly all a bunch of somewhat crazies, but it did energize the left-wing community a bit on campus, probably helped put students more into the student movement, more involved in local politics as a consequence, I think. It produced some interesting people, including Crazy Carl Hickerson was a shuttle bus striker. Travis County politics were pretty much turning around in the 70s. There was a very serious group of people who began on campus, Ed Windler and David Butts and Carlton Carl, as a matter of fact. But they began to put together a real coalition here. And as I think I've written, and you may know, that came to me to run for county commissioner. And I said, I didn't think so, but they ought to ask Anne. That turned out to have been a brilliant choice. She was one of the most incredible campaigners ever. I think, as I recall, it's the first time Eddie let anybody put a political sign on the Armadillo was he let Ann put a big sign up on the roof.
Yeah, pissed off Ronnie Earl. Excuse me. Yeah. Ronnie gave me a bill for the, for one of the cases that I brought to him. He'd done the first one for free, and then I wouldn't let him put up a sign. And I got a bill for $1,125. Ding, ding, ding. He was really good to me for a while, but that one was a spur in my ass. He didn't know how tight. I mean, I meant it when I said no more political signs. Nobody. Dave said, "How about Ann?" I said, "Of course." And so I only burned one bridge, but that was Ronnie.
So Ann's campaign was a county commissioner campaign was just an absolute demonstration of how you can run a political campaign. No one had ever done it like that before. She went door to door, every voter identified. She was just a total natural, and she clobbered the incumbent and began her political career. I think Ann, as governor, did a remarkable job of bringing a kind of elevated, as she promised, elevated minorities. And I guess Maddox did too. We did so at the Attorney General's office.
And how did this look from where you were sitting, Eddie? Sort of the old raw deal crowd into the early Threadgills. Were your spaces still kind of a place for political conversation and people to gather together and marshal their forces?
That kind of bounced around with me wherever I ended up. If there was some controversy, that meant somebody would want to use my facility. I found that controversies sold more beer than things that had no argument.
Yeah, whether you have a big victory or a huge loss, you're going to want something. Your memoir, Once Upon a Time in Texas, I was really struck by how poignant that was when you are talking about your mentors and then a little bit about your mentors' mentors and the lines that connect these generations. You have sort of Ralph Yarbrough in there and a role that he plays in an oil lease case later in your career that also reflects on Yarbrough's experience with the New Dealers when he was working with Jimmy Allred, as when Jimmy Allred was Attorney General and then governor back in the 30s. And then you're talking about John Henry Faulk's last days and the way that Ramblin' Jack Elliott sort of threaded through that. And once you bring Ramblin' Jack Elliott in the room, there's always kind of the ghost of Woody Guthrie and Leadbelly a little bit, and just all these lines that lead back. And it made me reflect on these podcasts we've been doing virtually where, I come from a different generation than y'all do. And it's been such a treat, not just to talk with y'all about your experiences, but to talk with y'all about the people who, informed your careers and made you. It's just like this whole thread of history that comes about. And so, Dave, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you saw your legacy in the law and politics in Texas after, this huge span of a career that we can't even cover at all.
Well, I've had a good time and I've been lucky, and that's the way I see it. I did it for fun by and large. Made a lot of good friends in the process, a lot of colleagues who I honor, and made relationships which were significant to me. I certainly won't have any regrets. I have nothing but good feelings about most everything I did. I didn't win everything, but I did win enough and did enough that I can feel fairly good about whatever the results. I don't think I fucked up too many things. Sure I did.
Just want to say how grateful I am that we were able to come together and do this. Thanks so much for joining us on it.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Eddie.
It keeps me in touch with y'all, and that's just the most delightful thing I could possibly want right now.
Okay. Enjoyed being with you all. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters, a memoir. Do it now. Do it right.